What's up gamers, Dreamcastguy here, and it's Top 10 Thursday. Sometimes the very best moments in a video game can be the boss fights. Whether you're playing something like Star Wars or Doom, there's always those times where you suddenly get confronted by an enemy that's bigger, stronger, and scarier than the rest, and this can really actually make things even more fun when you're playing it. But it can also have the opposite effect. If you're playing a game and encounter somebody who just downright sucks, it can completely kill your hype, or sometimes even ruin the game itself. So today, I wanted to actually dig into that, the enemies that really manage to screw up their encounters so badly that people despise them. These are my picks of the top 10 most hated gaming bosses. Spoilers, obviously. Number 10. Lucien. Of all the different genres of gaming that have really blown up over the course of the last couple of years, nothing is certainly more popular than open world stuff. I mean, people just love the idea of getting out to go and explore and discover things and level up, which is part of the reason that Fable back in the day became so popular. These games were big, and yes, they were kind of overhyped, but they were still fun all the same. Except for this. Basically, at the very end of Fable 2, you've managed to save the land and it's time to actually face off against the final boss, except there isn't one. You really just stand here and press shoot and the fight is over, which left fans very angry. Because come on, why did you spend so many hundreds of hours trying to train and prepare for a fight that's over in less than a second? Number 9. Seth. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that a lot of fighting games like to have extremely unfair bosses. This was basically made to originally try and steal quarters from you in the arcade. That's why when you're playing something like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, they get exponentially more difficult the deeper into the roster you get. But with this game, it doesn't really make sense because this was predominantly made for consoles. I mean, Street Fighter 4 was made to just be picked up and played on stuff like the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox. And yet, it's still just super brutal when you get to this jerk. Seriously, he can flip all over the screen, he can teleport, he can kill you with a singular combo, he has a grab move that essentially one-shots you. This guy doesn't even make sense. And that's part of the reason he annoyed so many people, is that it's not even about being good, it's basically just about being more lucky than Seth. Number 8. Nero. If you've ever tried any of the Final Fantasy games, perhaps you've noticed that most of them have very good endings. There's something about this series that just has such surprisingly good writing, and they really know how to end their stories with a really good climax, a conclusion that's both cool but also satisfying. Except for this one. Now, what's really weird is that at the end of Final Fantasy IX, you've managed to track down the world-destroying bad guy Kuja and defeat him in single combat, and in a final effort to try and kill you, he decides to blow up this giant rock called the World Stone. And it seems like, oh man, what a cool cliffhanger ending. And yet, when the mist settles, suddenly there's a different person standing in front of you besides Kuja, which is this guy, Nero, the god of death. And somehow, you and your friends just stand up and beat his butt. I mean, it doesn't really make sense, it doesn't really connect, and honestly, I don't think it was even planned into the last minute. And so because of it, pretty much everybody thinks that this was a very bad move, and it's still one of those fights that's kind of just despised. Number 7. The Human Reaper. It seems like in gaming that there are just very few truly legendary trilogies. Games that manage to just be back-to-back perfection, that have great setups and cool finishers, and a lot of stuff in them that just keeps you playing from one game to the next, and somehow they get even more epic as time goes on. But certainly, the original Mass Effect games absolutely nailed this. It is a trilogy that just blows my mind. But the one dark spot of it, in my opinion, is the conclusion to Mass Effect 2. Now, the whole game basically leads up to a giant suicide mission where you have to train just the most elite, awesome people to try and defend the galaxy. Except when you finally get here and it's time to perform the mission itself, you end up just fighting a giant evil robot version of a human that is very, very weak. Now, not only is this thing something that's very easy to kill, which is kind of a shocker, but it's also very, very pathetic. It's constantly looking like it's gasping for air and falling over itself. It's just one of those things of, after all that preparation, I couldn't believe that this is really what my final test was supposed to be. Number 6. Evil Eagle. Okay, so I'm sure you've already picked this out, but most of the games on this list are pretty mainstream. These are all things you've probably played yourself or maybe even beaten, except for this game. For whatever reason, I'm somebody who absolutely loves The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, but it's certainly more obscure. For whatever reason, it just seems to be one of those Nintendo hidden gems that isn't really as big and popular as I personally wish it would be. But it's definitely one of those games that I've played over and over again because I really like a lot of the style and aesthetic to it. But there's one spot of it that just really irks me every single time, which is this place. This is essentially a special little puzzle palace called the Eagle Tower, where you're constantly having to break pillars and solve problems to get higher and higher in this gauntlet. And when you reach the top, you're perhaps expecting to see some sort of huge boss encounter to make this whole trip worth it. But it's not. It's this really weird 2D encounter that's just painfully simple. I mean, just by aiming your sword up and repeatedly swiping it, you can defeat this boss before he even gets a chance to attack. I mean, what is the point in making such a big and complicated and rewarding dungeon if you're not going to really finish it with an appropriate flair? Number 5. General Raam. It's kind of fun to look back on the original Gears of War titles now because these things were just huge hits. I mean, personally, I actually think that Gears of War is one of the reasons that the Xbox 360 was such an enormous success, because everybody was buying them just to play these. Not only did they have some of the most cutting-edge graphics, but they also had some of the sharpest multiplayer at the time. But to me, I was very, very invested in the story itself. I liked seeing the lore and what's going on in these cool, creepy caverns. To me, that was a huge draw, but I always kind of regret when I get to the end of the first Gears of War because it's just such a sloppy ending. I mean, basically, you're here and you've just planted a super nuke in the enemy hive. It should be a time where you're going to be cruising off into the sunset, when suddenly this big, beefy jerk decides to drop on your ride and fight you to the death. Well, here's the thing, General Raam does not behave like any other unit in the entire game. He has this special cloak of living bats that basically eat all the bullets for him and keep him alive, which means that you need to constantly go through this cycle of breaking off his barrier, hurting him a little bit, and then running away. It's an encounter that can be very, very infuriating because it's just so poorly designed. It's just sloppy. I mean, it's not that this is something that completely breaks the game or ruins the experience, but after such a phenomenal shooter experience, to end on this wet fart was such a bad choice. Number 4. Solidus Snake. There might not be a director in the gaming world who's more respected, or at least renowned, than Hideo Kojima. This man, using his giant genius brain, has managed to craft some of the most convoluted and confusing experiences that people are still studying to this day. But one of his projects that was certainly controversial at the time was Metal Gear Solid 2. Now, trying to explain why exactly people were just so split on loving it or hating it would take an entire video. But instead, I want to focus on its ending, and why this last boss is something that's left a lot of people specifically extremely divided. Basically, this is the President of the United States, and yeah, I don't know why the President's here, but additionally, the President wants to engage you in a sword fight after you just crashed a robot into this. I mean, okay, so that's all weird, but the main thing is, the fight itself, despite being very, very enthralling to watch, is kind of just clunky. It's not is responsive. After playing an entire game of using cool CQC, close quarters combat, or really crazy machine guns and stuff, to suddenly just be given a sword and told, hey, it's time to chop that dude up, it just doesn't play as well as people probably would have hoped, but that's just kind of the best we got, and it's part of the reason that to this day people don't really mention Metal Gear Solid 2. Number 3. Laura. There are times when you're fighting a boss that has so many interesting mechanics and is very cool because he has all sorts of giant special effects, but it can still just be a little bit annoying because of when you have to fight them. And that's kind of the problem with Laura. This is basically like the ghost of your ex-wife in The Evil Within 2, which, by the way, is a spectacular game, but when you actually get confronted by her, she ambushes you, and here's the downside, this is after you've already fought like 800 other dudes, which means you are going to be very low on ammo, and Laura has a ton of health. But wait, it gets worse, because Laura, if she touches you, it instantly breaks your neck and gives you a game over, which means that the only way to actually deal with this encounter is to perpetually run in a giant circle, shooting at her and shooting at her and shooting at her. But wait, there is a solution. If you do a hidden side quest, you can get a flamethrower that'll kill her very fast. But most people aren't going to know that. The first time that people do this encounter, there is a 100% chance you're going to die because it's just got so many mechanics that you don't know until you've already failed. It's just one of those fights that really stands out in my mind because I'm kind of just puzzled why the thought that this in particular would be a good idea. Number 2. Atlus. While I was writing this video, I really struggled over whether or not I should put this game as number 1 or number 2, mostly because a lot of people freaking hate this boss fight, and I mean that with a capital H. The main reason being that not only is this a very lackluster encounter that doesn't make a lot of sense, but additionally, BioShock is a fantastic masterpiece. It is a first-person shooter that manages to be creepy and artistic and have very crazy architecture and all sorts of interesting, very deep philosophical meanings in it, but a lot of that relies on Andrew Ryan, an encounter that happens much earlier in the game. By the time that Andrew Ryan is dead and you start to just hunt down Atlus himself, the game is certainly on a decline. It's trying to coast into a very satisfying finish, and you end on this. All of a sudden, the guy you've been trying to track for half the experience has turned himself randomly into a huge, giant, Incredible Hulk ripoff, and the only way to kill him is to slowly drain his power. This fight, in my opinion, has really managed to get under people's skin simply because it's confusing. It doesn't even really need to be here. It's just kind of one of those weird things that seems like they tacked it on purely out of importance. Like they felt like we need to have something before the ending credits, so let's throw this out here. It's honestly really disappointing, and I hate to say that because BioShock is still a 10 out of 10 game. It's just that little tiny blip at the end that basically says, hey, this is where we could have done better, and it's pretty clear when you replay it that this was not a good choice. Number 1. Yellow Devil. For the first real decade of gaming, back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of schoolyard talk, a lot of debate among our friends and stuff about what are the hardest games and the hardest bosses. The experiences that seemed practically impossible just due to sheer difficulty. And Mega Man was always at the top of the list, because while these games are very sharp and actually very tight in their controls and their general methodology, they require many hours of practice to be good at them. Every boss had different mechanics and different things you had to memorize in order to conquer them. But what always drove me nuts specifically about the Yellow Devil is that he kind of breaks those rules. In my opinion, this guy is just something that feels like he defies the conventions of even normal Mega Man. Trying to constantly dodge his attacks and his randomized patterns was just infuriating. I mean, I just generally do not like this boss fight at all, and part of that is because he kills me so much. Yes, I'm bad at Mega Man, I'll fully admit it, but this dude still manages to transcend that. He's become almost a mythological figure just due to this sheer difficulty that doesn't even really fit in the rest of the already hard and very enjoyable Mega Man universe. And for that reason, I'm awarding this guy as the number 1 most hated boss fight. Did your favorite baddie not make the list? Got an idea for a future top 10? Leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all and keep dreaming. As I record this video, this is actually right before the launch of a giant MMO called World of Warcraft Classic, so I'm probably not about to sleep for the next week, so do me a favor, definitely give this video a like, because I might be dead by the time this auto-uploads. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.